Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Carvan Special Lectures. This is Ishan Sharma, and with me, you can see a very special guest, Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed, author of a wonderful book that I have been reading lately on Jinnah, his successes, his failures, and role in history, which I think is a must read for every citizen of the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, both India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. So today in this session, Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed is going to speak about the two-nation theory from the Lahore Resolution that came in 1940 to the Quit India movement that started in 1942. Professor Ahmed doesn't need an introduction, but as it is the format of this lecture, I'll introduce him. Professor Ahmed is a Swedish political scientist and author of Pakistani descent. He holds a PhD in political science from Stockholm University. Currently, he is Professor Emeritus of Social Science at Stockholm University. He's also an honorary senior fellow of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He was also a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and the South Asian Studies Program, National University of Singapore from June 2007 to June 2010. He is the editor in general of the Liberal Art and Social Sciences International Journal. He is a member of the Editorial Advisory Board of Asian Ethnicity, Journal of Punjab Studies, IPRI Journal, Islamabad, and PIPS Research Journal of Conflict and Peaceful Studies, Islamabad. It is truly an honor, Professor Ahmed, to host you this evening, and we look forward to the conversation and the lecture. This is a two-lecture series on Jinnah and his role in history. This lecture, as I said, will be on the Lahore Resolution. The next part of this lecture will trace the role of Jinnah, Mountbatten, Nehru, and Gandhi in the whole national movement and the partition. Thank you so much, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishan Sharma, for the invitation. It's my pleasure, and I feel that it's a privilege to talk to your group of friends. And the topic you have chosen is most certainly a topic on which we need to spend quite a bit of time to understand the origins of the two-nation theory, the social, political conditions in which it emerged, and its implications and ramifications over time. Of course, when we agreed that it will be from the Lahore Resolution to the Quit India movement, and then you told me I have to speak for 1 hour, I realized that I need to give you a background into the origins of the two-nation theory, and then maybe focus on this period that we have agreed on. So we begin with the basic understanding of India being united as a modern type of state by a colonial power. The colonial power introduced some of the institutions of representation, and one can say that they also changed the rules of the game. In the past, if you see how one government was changed by another, then it was some man of destiny with a sword in the hand, defeating others and capturing power. The struggle against British colonialism was not conducted by such means, but through arguments, ideas, ideological commitments, and a lot of politics, manipulation, maneuvering, in which I think the British were central to all that was happening. Let us imagine somebody in the second half of the 19th century in the subcontinent, feeling that a time may come when the British will leave India, and what will be the type of government, the type of society we will inherit, and how will we run it. So there were reactions which were indicative of apprehension, a fear of an uncertain future without the British. And as a reaction, some people took a communal position. By communalism, I mean a position in which you consider your own community, religious community, let's say it, as your object of loyalty. A benign form of communalism or community sense could be communitarianism, where several communities live together, but in a pluralist order, with a view to sharing power and the basic, in the running of the government, having a share for all those who constitute the population of a country. But communalism is also an antagonistic way of looking at others. So if I'm a Muslim, for me, Hindus and the rest would be things to fear, things to contain, and to assert my own group's claims. Very often this claim is called the right of self-determination. Now, let me say this, that the right of self-determination is also a product of the 19th century rise of nationalism. Nationalism rose in the aftermath of the French Revolution, 1789, but in the 19th century, it caught the fancy of the colonies in Latin America, earlier in North America, where the colonies revolted against the British king, and then in Latin America, they revolted against the Spanish monarchy. In our own part of the world, the idea of nationalism, some people think, started with the uprising of 1857. Although what we know is that it was sporadic. It did not involve Indian masses on a very large scale. Some parts of the population did take part, while others remained loyal to the British, even supported the British in crushing the uprising of 1857, which we fondly describe as the War of Independence. From the British point of view, it was a mutiny of their Indian native soldiers in the Bengal army mainly. But let's say that's the first indication of a nascent type of nationalism, but one in which Hindus, Muslims, and the rest all belong to the idea of an Indian nation, a proto-nation, a nation in the formation, a nation in the imagination, you can call it. But I think it's from 1885 where a platform is established which formally claims to represent all Indians, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and the rest. And that is the founding of the Indian National Congress. But, you know, I mean, I don't have to repeat it, but after 1857 in Bengal, there was a virulent anti-Muslim sentiment expressed by some of the Bengali intellectuals. And then we have Sir Syed warning Muslims to keep away from Hindus and seek close collaboration with the British. So already you have the Hindu community and the Muslim community coming together, being the two major communities in the founding of the Indian National Congress. Although, let me admit that in the beginning and largely thereafter, the Muslim presence in the Indian National Congress was limited, but still it was there from the beginning. Two of the earliest presidents of the Indian National Congress were Muslims, Badruddin Tayyib ji and another gentleman whose name I keep on forgetting, but Siani would be his surname, both Bombay Muslims. But they were the followers of Sir Sayyid, opposed to any party, any movement in which all Indians were involved. And then there were the Bengali intellectuals who thought that the Muslims are going to be a problem for them. But we quickly move forward, and one other case already in the 19th century is 1880, an editorial published in Lahore in the Rafiq-e-Hind newspaper published by Muharram Ali Chishti, where he was very much against Hindus and Muslims cooperating. He also stood for some sort of regeneration of Muslim power. So you have these ideas already in the 19th century. Then we move into the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, you find that through a number of India Acts, representative institutions are introduced in the councils, and this went on to be part of the provincial legislatures and so on. And the right to vote was limited to a very small number of people, propertied people, upper caste, upper class people from all communities. Yet there was a problem that in a general election, because the Muslims were a minority of about 25%, economically backward, educationally backward, their actual numbers who could vote were fewer than their percentage of the population. So an idea developed that we should be granted separate electorates. The British had started disliking the Congress, which originally was meant just to petition the government about some changes needed in India. But when the Indian National Congress became a platform demanding greater employment for Indians, all Indians, greater representation for Indians, the British administrators, the colonial power became wary of such demands. And they looked forward to some way of containing the influence of the Indian National Congress. Even at that stage, the Congress was a petitioning party, not a mass party. But then in 1906, Muslim notables go and meet the Viceroy, Lord Minto, and plead with him for separate electorates and even for weightage, which means over-representation, more representation than their numbers to Muslims, saying that the Muslims are located in large numbers in the northwest, from where all the invasions have come, as well as in the northeast, from where potential invasions can also take place, but mainly in the northwest. And therefore, although it's a minority, but it's a minority which has martial traditions and can be very important for the defense of India. This was granted in 1909. You have the partition of Bengal, supported by sections of the Bengali society, Hindu society. Initially, the Muslims didn't know how to deal with it, but later on, they found that when power shifted to Dhaka, because of the division of Bengal, the Muslims there benefited. So you do find the two communities benefiting from different initiatives of the British government. So in 1909, separate electorates were granted to the Muslims, and most of us would agree that that's the beginning of the British uh, intervention to keep Muslims and Hindus separate from one another, never to unite again in a demand for national self-determination for all Indians. And then you have all these stages as we go down in time, where the British grant representation in 1919 to the 6th, thereby in the Punjab neutralizing the Muslim majority. So in the Punjab, they granted it to the Sikhs to ensure that the Muslim factor in Punjab was kept at bay. On the all India level, they had granted it to the Muslims. So you find that the British, on the one hand, encouraging some sort of responsible government, but also through policy, isolating people from one another. We come quickly now to the 1935 Act. I think that's where the two-nation theory and the whole story becomes politically relevant. I mean, individuals having ideas about the two communities not being fit to be converted into one cohesive, coherent nation. These ideas did exist. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, Bhai Parmanand of Multan had some ideas about all Muslims being pushed west of River Indus, and those who were in India being converted to Hinduism, if possible. In 1924, Lala Lajpat Rai also supported this idea after there were anti-Hindu riots, vicious riots in Kohat, which is in the northwest frontier province of current Pakistan. Okay, you see these ideas being expressed. Then in 1929, once again, we have to go quickly review all this. The Indian National Congress meets at Lahore and demands full independence for India. Then in 1930, Allama Iqbal, the great poet, thinker, he is invited to Allahabad, where he demands a separate state for Muslims in northwestern India. Now, it's interesting. 1929, Lahore, the Congress demands freedom for the whole of India, complete freedom. This is checkmated by Iqbal giving a counter call for a Muslim state in 1930, a year later. Although when Iqbal was asked to explain what was this whole idea about a Muslim state in northwestern India, he sort of backed out, just not to annoy the British. And he said he was just hoping that in the northwestern part of the British Empire, a frontline Muslim state could be created. Remember, this frontline Muslim state finally was created in 1947. We come to that, but Iqbal was one who proposed it. I have in the Jinnah book said that Iqbal is considered the thinker, the philosopher of the Muslim nation. But this state in northwestern India included only about 22% of the Muslim population of India. He had forgotten Bengal, where most of the Muslim population in bulk was concentrated, and then in the rest of India. 1933, Chaudhry Rahmat Ali comes up with the idea of Pakistan, this acronym, P for Punjab, A for Afghania, which is the northwestern frontier, K for Kashmir, and Istan for Sindh and Balochistan. This was coined by a Punjabi, Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, at Cambridge. It's called Now or Never. Then you have, of course, from the Hindu side, if we want to call it, Savarkar, first of all, beginning the discussion on Hindutva, and then in 1937, writing a pamphlet in which he says that it's naive of Gandhi and Nehru. He didn't name them, but it's understood that the Congress is trying to bring Hindus and Muslims together into one fold. That is impossible. These are two nations who will always be separate from one another. In 1938, a year later, Govalkar, the founder of the Supremo of RSS, he writes another short booklet saying that we should learn from Germany how they have treated the Jews. And in India, non-Hindus cannot expect to have the same rights as Hindus. They must accept second-rate citizen status in India. So these ideas already were emerging in the 1930s. But what is the major breakthrough where all this then converts into a political demand, and thereafter this ultimately culminated with the creation of Pakistan. So in 1935, the British introduced a new act whereby the voting rights were expanded to about 11% of the total population of India. Universal adult franchise were never granted at any stage. But 11%, which some people have calculated, would mean that the adult population of India, 28.7%, got the right to vote. Every fourth person, more or less, had the right to vote. And the right to vote and representation, remember, all were related to the British directly administered provinces, not the 500 and plus princely states. Anyhow, the 1935 Act was a very interesting British way of maintaining the differences and yet granting more voting rights. Excellent policy from a colonial perspective, how to perpetuate British rule while increasing the participatory rights of the Indians. Let's say some sort of colonial type of democracy limited to 11% of the population. It was announced that elections would be held, but one of the provisions was that the federal government part of the act would come into force only when the princely states voluntarily join this union, which they did not. So elections were held only to the provincial assemblies, provincial elections, in which the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League, I should have mentioned. 1906 is the Shimla deputation demanding separate electorates and weightage for Muslims. The same year, in December, the All India Muslim League was founded. But the main party which represented the freedom struggle was in the Indian National Congress, which by its own statutes was open to all Indians. So it was a secular party, and the 1928 Nehru report had said that there will be no state religion. Men and women will have equal rights. Hindustani will be the national language of India with two scripts of equal importance, Devanagari and the Persian Urdu script. India will be a federation with a strong center. I think 39 items were given to the center and 67 items to the provinces. So it was going to be a federation, but with an effective center. Weightage was rejected, and separate electorates were rejected, which the All India Muslim League resisted and objected to. So this is the background. 1935 Act comes and elections are held in 1937. The political parties of those times contested the elections. The Congress won a landslide in the Hindu majority provinces. It did contest Muslim seats, 108, reserved for Muslims, setting up Congress candidates, of which I think it won 58. That's all, of which half the seats were won in the Northwest Frontier province, where the Khudai Khidmatgar of Abdul Ghaffar Khan were allies of the Congress. So very few Muslim seats it could win apart from this in the Northwest Frontier province. What about the All India Muslim League? In the Muslim majority provinces, it was routed. For example, in Sindh, it did not win a single seat. In Punjab, it won 2 seats, which became 1 when one of the elected members crossed the floor and joined the regional party of Punjab Unionist Party, which had both Hindus, Muslims mainly, and Sikhs, as their allies. And it was a intercommunal party for all Punjabis, okay? Then in the Northwest Frontier province, the Khudai Khidmatgar swept the elections and the Muslim League was rejected completely. It did modestly well in the Hindu majority provinces. In Bengal, I think there were 84 seats reserved for the Muslims. It won 40, and 44 were won by the opposition party of the Muslims, I think Christian Sramak Party. So you can see that the Muslim League's claim to represent all Muslims could not be upheld by the results of the elections. The Indian National Congress, and this is a big, big controversy, especially it's difficult for Indian historians to accept it, but there is enough literature. I've read Maulana Azad's book on this, India Wins Freedom, where he goes into this question. There was some sort of informal understanding that in the UP, irrespective of who won the elections, how many seats, both Congress and Muslim League would form a coalition government. Of course, some very senior Indian historians reject this. They say that there was some loose discussion among some individuals, but this was never officially agreed. So, I mean, I've given you both positions. But after the Congress won elections, Jawaharlal Nehru made this statement that there are only 2 parties in India, the British and the Indian National Congress. And in terms of electoral support, he was justified in saying this. In the Muslim majority provinces, the non-Muslim League parties had won, regional parties who wanted to keep the Congress out. But at this stage, then Jinnah was faced with an ultimatum, I would say. Either you accept that the Congress is the only party and give up this vain attempt to assert the identity of the All India Muslim League as a separate party exclusively representative of Muslims. That's one option. Or you take a stand and you try to fight back. I think the British were all informed about what was happening. But what we know is that in 1936, Nehru had made another major blunder, I would say. He had declared that in a free India, there will be the Zimidari system will be abolished. Remember, in UP, the big landlords were very often Muslims, overly represented, if not in a majority. And then in the northwestern provinces, Sindh, Punjab, and Northwest Frontier Province, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the landlords were all Muslims. Balochistan was not a province until Pakistan came into being. It had a tribal jirga, and the tribal lords were also big landlords. So when this declaration was made, and then the second one, that there are only two powers in India, then Jinnah took up a confrontational posture. He said that there are four parties in India: the British, the Indian National Congress, the All India Muslim League or the Muslims, and the princely states. Because you see, the princely states, on the princely states, the Congress party was that we will amalgamate them into the Indian Union in a free India. Whereas Jinnah wanted to encourage the princely states that their sovereign rights, independence will be maintained. So this is the type of politics which were emerging. Now comes a period called the Congress ministries from 1937 to 1939, where the Muslim League launched a massive campaign. In 1937, Jinnah had talked to the governor of Bombay, the English governor, telling him that from now onwards, since the Congress has rejected the Muslim League as a party of any significance, he is going to mobilize Muslim opinion on the basis of communalism, to preach that the Indian National Congress, if it comes to power in a united India, it will be Hindu Raj. Hinduism would attack Islam, would harm Muslims. I mean, these are his speeches which I have quoted throughout the book, and you can read them. The All India Muslim League published two reports, the Pirpur report and the Sharif report, in which allegedly details were given of the Congress ministries persecuting, discriminating against Muslims. But the British governors, who actually hated the Congress, because the Congress alone was demanding independence, complete independence from India. If you look at what they were writing, all of them said that there is no evidence that the Congress ministries targeted the Muslim minorities in their provinces. And I will just quote Viceroy Lord Linlithgow. This is what he said. He told Jinnah there was no evidence of any positive instance of real oppression. So even the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, is on record rejecting the claims. Not only the governors, we can look at the governors also. Governor Haig says that the Muslim League is deliberately, it's a deliberate falsity to a degree which even the maneuvers of politics can hardly excuse. This is what he says about allegations of Congress targeting Muslims. Sir Maurice Hallett, Governor of Bihar, sent a similar opinion. He informed, speaking from my experience of Bihar and the United Provinces, I cannot see any orders passed by government which have been detrimental to Muslim interests. So the reports of the British governors did not uphold the allegations made in the Pirpur report and in the Sharif report. Now, here comes another major blunder of the Indian National Congress. On 1st September 1939, the Second World War breaks out. Okay. On the 3rd of September, Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, commits India to the war. the Congress reacts rightly in terms of constitutional theory and representation that India has been committed to a war without consulting the elected representatives of the people of India. And by that, they meant basically the Congress, which was ruling in 8 provinces. Whereas in the Muslim majority provinces, it were regional parties, especially the Punjab Unionist Party was a loyalist, pro-British party. So the Congress was right in objecting to what Lord Linlithgow had done. But some of us think that had the Congress, within the Congress, there was a discussion that this was a war against fascism. So we should give conditional support to the British. And in doing so, the British opposition to the freedom of India could be, minimized, or at least the British could be put on the back foot, because if the Congress supports British efforts during the war, it naturally must gain the gratitude of the British. But if you oppose it, then it's in the other direction. But the decision taken by the Indian National Congress was that unless the British transferred power to the elected representatives of the Indian people, they would not support the war effort. Although a position against fascism had been taken, but the final decision was against it. Then on the 7th of September, Jinnah goes and meets Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, and tells him, look, if you want to keep the Congress at bay, then you must accept the support of the All India Muslim League and the Muslims of India, who would support you if you promise to grant them the right of self-determination at the end of the war. And from that time onwards, we find Linlithgow cultivating Jinnah, and Jinnah taking openly hostile positions to the Congress, because the British Muslim League liaison had been established, and it was directed basically against the Indian National Congress. So if you keep all this in mind, I will quote an Indian scholar, Gaur Rizvi. This is what he writes, that Linlithgow, his doctoral thesis is on Lord Linlithgow, and Rizvi writes this. He, in the brackets Jinnah, this is what Linlithgow has said. He, that is Jinnah, had given me valuable help by standing up against the Congress claims, and I was duly grateful. It was clear that if he, Mr. Jinnah, had supported the Congress demand and confronted me with a joint demand, the strain upon me and His Majesty's government would have been very great indeed. I thought, therefore, I could claim to have a vested interest in his position, in Jinnah's position. So Jinnah's position was supportive directly of the war effort the British were seeking help for, whereas the Congress had taken a stand against it. So that's where the liaison, their connection is established. While all this was happening, how was the Congress looking at the developments? In January 1940, at Jinnah's residence, Dr. Ambedkar came. Then Mr. Periyar, also named the leader of South Indian Dravidian people, if we can call it. The three met for several days, and the press was hoping that they will form a party of Muslims Dalits, and South Indian Dravidians as a counterweight to the Congress. But later on, nothing came out of it. I have in the Jinnah book shown that that's where Dr. Ambedkar became disillusioned with Jinnah and the Muslim League and with Islam generally. He came out, wrote very harshly about Islam, saying that it's a brotherhood only of the believers and not of humanity. Ambedkar, as you know, was proverbially against the caste system, and his position on Hinduism is too well known for me to repeat here. Mr. Periyar, he also expressed disappointment with Jinnah. What was Jinnah's position? Jinnah wanted now just to be the leader of the Muslims. At some point, Gandhi had hurt him by calling him a Muslim leader. I mean, that argument I've presented in my Jinnah book, and you can read it there. There was a personal reason of Jinnah for asserting his separate leadership when he left the Congress and became a leader of the Muslim nationalist movement. Okay, so on the 18th of March, the Congress met at Ramgarh, I think in Maharashtra, and gave the final call for the freedom of India, saying that we don't want British rule anymore. They should transfer power and leave already when the war was going on. And this was once again unrealistic. Why? Because the British war effort included about 2.5 million Indian soldiers recruited mainly from the northwest part of the subcontinent, many Sikhs, a very large number of Muslims, of course, Hindus as well from the rest of India. 2.5 million soldiers were recruited for the war. And how would the British transfer power and leave when they needed all these soldiers for the war? So I think this was the Congress took an unrealistic position, and it all benefited Muhammad Ali Jinnah and his claim for what later on came to be the demand for Pakistan. So, as I said, this idea of the two nations, I've talked about Savarkar, Gowalkar, Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, Allama Iqbal, all of them have talked in terms of two nations, and the two nations not being able to constitute one cohesive Indian nation. Whereas the Congress stood for a multicultural, multi-ethnic Indian nation consisting of all communities. And the All India Muslim League now taking the stand that it is the sole party of the Muslims, and the Congress should deal with them. So all this came finally culminated with the famous Lahore session of the All India Muslim League annual session. It began on the 22nd of March and ended on the 25th. You must look into the book of all the speeches which were made demanding, it was based on the idea of India being home to two major nations, Hindus and Muslims, and many other minor communities, Sikhs, Dalits, and the rest. So this was the change which took place now in defining the national character of the Indian people, that the Muslims were a nation and the Hindus were a nation, and the rest were then communities or nationalities with entitled to their cultural rights and so on and so forth. The speeches there are very clear that we want India to be divided to create Muslim states in the northwestern and northeastern parts of India where Muslims constitute a majority. Then on the 25th of March, when the main discussions and the Lahore resolution had been passed, Jinnah gave a press conference where he made clear that he stood for a division of India. This is what he says. The declaration of a goal, which we have definitely laid down, of the division of India is, in my opinion, a landmark in the future history of the Muslims of India. I am asked, what are the means by which we will realize this goal? Firstly, by reasoning with and persuading our Hindu friends and the British government. And then he goes on, I thoroughly believe that the idea of one united India is a dream. Given goodwill and a friendly understanding, Muslim India and Hindu India can live as most friendly neighbors, free from clashes and friction to their respective spheres, and peacefully develop the government of their states to their own satisfaction, respectively. Let me point out that after this resolution was passed, within a week, the Sikh leader Sundar Singh Majithia gave a press conference where he said that if the Muslims want to divide India on a religious basis, then they can be sure that we will resist living in a communal Pakistan dominated by Muslims. If you can't live in an India of all Indians, irrespective of their religions and so on, then within a communal Pakistan, we will resist. So already this two-nation theory model adopted by the by the All India Muslim League was challenged by the Sikhs, but not by the Congress yet. The Congress till that's the next lecture, insisted on keeping India united for all Indians. Okay. Now let me quote some of Jinnah's speeches. On the 1st of April, he told the Delhi Muslims that 30 million Muslims of the minority provinces should not stand in the way of 60 million of the Muslim majority provinces being liberated from the yoke of Hindu Raj. Now, in opposition to the All India Muslim League, those Muslims who were opposed to the partition of India met in Delhi in the end of April, and it was called the Azad Muslim Conference against the partition. And Muslims of working class background, many sectarian organizations like the Shia Conference, the Ahle Hadith Conference, the Deoband Jamiyat-e Ulama Hind, who were opposed to the partition of India, they had always supported a united India on the basis of Wataniyat, which is the same as Congress, that all those who live in India and India is their homeland, they have equal rights in this India. So a major Muslim organization also supported the Congress. All of them came to Delhi and declared that we don't want India to be partitioned. We want to have a shared future with Hindus and other communities of India. But I think by that time, the British had realized that if they were to carry on the war and keep India within their grip, it is the All India Muslim League support and Jinnah support that they needed, and not these minor parties, the noises they were being made. So, for example, on 8 December 1940, Jinnah says, if the Congress wants to achieve independence, there is no other way of doing it except by the two communities agreeing to live as separate entities. Pakistan is the only way to India's freedom. This is also quoted on the back of my book. On the 3rd of January 1941, he says, the British government, the parliament, and the British public would make the greatest mistake if they were carried away by the Congress propaganda that the demand of Muslim India for Pakistan was merely put forward for bargaining or for treating it as uh, the uncompromising. Uh, yeah, he's saying that don't think that we are using the demand for Pakistan as a bargaining chip. 10th March 1941 at Aligarh Muslim University, he says, Pakistan is only a practical goal, is not only a practical goal, but the only goal if you want to save Islam from complete annihilation in the country. So here he says that if there is a united India under Congress rule, which would be Hindu Raj, Islam will be annihilated. In some other speeches, he says that the Muslims would be annihilated, obliterated. So there are all these speeches which I've quoted. Then on the 30th of March, he was in Kanpur. Eshan, this would interest you most. This is where I think the Muslims must have asked him, we are going to be left in India. What will happen to us then if you create Pakistan in the northeast and northwest? And this is what he says. In order to liberate 7 crore Muslims, where they were in a majority, he was willing to perform the last ceremony of martyrdom, if necessary, and let the 2 crores of Muslims be smashed. He must have spoken in a situation of great irritation why people were asking this question. Because after the Lahore Revolution, it was clear that if there was going to be a Pakistan, it will be in the northeastern and northwestern zones of India. And all these, actually, it should have been 3 crores of Muslims, but he reduced it to 2 crores. Even 2 crores is a very large number. So if there was going to be a partition on the basis of religion, either total population should have moved in the two states, or the whole idea of a Hindu India and a Muslim India was a flawed one. This is what I've shown in my book, but that we take up later. What about the Indian National Congress? The Indian National Congress, after having opposed the war effort, demanding that power be transferred to them, then took up uncompromising positions. And one reason was that Subhash Chandra Bose and the rest, let's say the more radical types of nationalists, they wanted that an armed struggle should be, an armed revolution should be started now. And they looked upon the Japanese as some sort of friends. The Japanese had entered the war in 1941. Subhash Chandra Bose left India, secretively went first to Russia. Russia didn't support him because by that time Hitler had attacked Russia, and Russia and the British were allies in the war against Germany. So how could they support Bose in India against the British? All these things have to be kept in mind. But it seems that Subhash Chandra Bose started influencing the cadres in the Indian National Congress. So Mahatma Gandhi and the rest then started what is known as the individual satyagraha, that you should protest and get arrested against continuing British rule, demanding that power be transferred to the Indian people, which meant practically the Indian National Congress as the major party. In these circumstances, on 14th April 1941, at Madras, Jinnah said, let me tell you as clearly as I can possibly define it, that the goal of the All India Muslim League is this. We want the establishment of completely independent states in the northwest and eastern zones of India, with full control finally of defense, foreign affairs, communications, customs, currency, exchange. We do not want any circumstance, we do not want in any circumstances a constitution of an all India character with one government at the center. We will never agree to that. If we once agree to that, let me tell you, the Muslims will be absolutely wiped out of existence. So Jinnah is what is known as he's upping the ante, all the time increasing the amount of hostility, tension between Hindus and Muslims, between the All India Muslim League and the Indian National Congress. What do the British do? The British sent the Cripps mission in 1942 in March. The Cripps mission agrees that at the end of the war, power will be transferred to India, although it doesn't say as a dominion or as an independent state. I mean, the British were excellent at all this, keeping things vague and confused. But they also mentioned, the Cripps mission mentioned that the minorities will be consulted and no agreement will be reached which ignored minority interest. This way, the Muslim League was sort of given some encouragement that the right to self-determination will be considered. Both the Congress and the Muslim League rejected it. The Congress, because the Cripps mission talked about a division of India through the right of self-determination in some form, while Jinnah and the Muslim League rejected it because they said, we have taken a position, we want separate Pakistan, we do not want to be part of any Indian union. On the 21st of May 1942, Jinnah tells Chapman of the News of America, and then he makes a general statement to the foreign press in July in 1942, saying the only way for Britain to do justice is to hand over the Muslim homelands to the Muslims and the Hindu homelands to the Hindus. The Congress then commits what I think is the ultimate blunder. The individual satyagrahas had resulted in Patel, Nehru, and Maulana Azad, and many Congress leaders being arrested. Although they were, after a while, even released, but within the Congress now, a decision was taken to go for an all-out confrontation with the British. And that was the call given by Mahatma Gandhi. The Quit India movement. The Quit India movement discussion took place, I think, in August. By the 8th, this resolution had been agreed. On the 9th, then the British raided and arrested whatever Congress leaders were still not in jail, in prison. And although there was an uprising, Gandhi had given the radical call that do or die, something like this he had said. Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, responded by ordering massive repression. Remember, this thing we should have mentioned. How did the British rule India? 1,100 civil servants as deputy commissioners, only 55,000 British troops, and the rest of the machinery manned by Indians, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, whosoever, Christians of different castes, different social classes. They were all willing to serve the British. because the British state had created some sort of continuity and stability. There was a freedom movement, a massive freedom movement led by the Congress, and a separatist movement led by the All India Muslim League. But were all the Indian masses really behind this freedom struggle? One can always discuss. What we know is that when the Quit India movement call was given, did the British fail in crushing it? No. People were whipped publicly, some were even killed, and in the thousands people were sent to jail. At that point, Jinnah supported, he said that this Congress move was a way of blackmailing the British in their hour of need. We should support the British war effort, and he hoped that the British will, at the end of the war, give the Muslims the right of self-determination leading to Pakistan. I think I will stop at this point with the presentation on the two-nation theory. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed, for this.
Your voice, I can't hear you.
Can you now? Can you now hear
Yeah,
me?
I can. Yes, I can hear you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, for that lecture. If we can summarize it, the idea of this religious identity in two nation has less to do with the Congress and more to do with the ardent advocates of communal notion of nation building like Savarkar, as you mentioned, Allama Iqbal, and later Jinnah, also Muslim League. And it was, I think, around 1920s when Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League started developing this idea of two nation. And
Right.
as you said, the Congress was against the idea of partition till the very end
Yeah.
of this discussion. And also, you talked about World War II, and around the end of 1939, Lord Lilintho, the then Viceroy of India, did not receive the kind of support that he wanted from the Congress for war
Right.
efforts,
Correct.
even though there were substantial differences of opinion the way forward between Nehru and Gandhi at that time.
Yeah.
So the Congress promised help, but with heavy caveats, including independence of united India. And
Yeah.
on the other hand,
It was a conditional help the British were not going at all to agree to.
yes.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, Jinnah was far more canny, less conditional, more tactical in his approach, and he extended support, including the support of Bengal, Punjab, and Sindh, as
Yeah.
you mentioned, the Muslim majority regions.
Right.
And then it was also a fact that Congress failed in persuading either Jinnah to give up his dream or in convincing the British not to help Jinnah take that path.
True.
Thank you so much, sir, for that lecture, and we look forward to the second part of the lecture, that is on the 31st of October, 31st of August,
Yeah.
just 2 days from now. And they will talk about the whole process and the many reasons for the partition of India, because putting blame on one personality is, I think, is an oversimplification of history, and history is much more complex than we think, and
Absolutely.
it has many reasons. So we'll try to uncover those reasons. And thank you so much, sir, for taking your time for doing this.
Okay.
And
There were no questions and answers, that session is, you don't have a session like that?
we have some questions for you.
No,
This
but if you want to finish now, I'm very happy with it. But if you want to have some questions, it's up to you. I mean,
we can take 2 or 3 questions. This is by Jyoti Thakur.
okay.
Her question is, was making India a secular state instead of Hindu nation a mistake, considering ongoing tussle between two communities in India?
Well, if India was going to be a communal state, then the creation of Pakistan is totally justified. Why would Muslims want to live in an India which will be a communal state? The only reason they could argue for a united India for all Indians was if it was going to be a secular state. Actually, it is the communal Hindus and the communal Muslims who would like to blame the Congress for the partition, but they don't understand that if India was going to be a communal state of Hindus, then the Muslims were absolutely justified in demanding a separate state and getting it if they could. So I don't see how one can argue that way.
Yeah. Second question, would you agree with the point that even before partition, the failures of talks between Jinnah and Congress had a fallout on the ground? And during the Quit India movement, there was a parallel rise of extremist views on both sides, and till 46 as Congress
No,
remained.
but you see, that's for the second part of the lecture, the second lecture. I stopped at 42 just because we had agreed that we won't go beyond it. So let's not take up things which belong to the next lecture. Okay?
Sure, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time, and we'll see you on 31st of August for the
Yeah.
second part of the session. And
Okay.
thank you so much, everybody, for joining in this session. It was really an honor having you all on our platform. See you again on 31st. Thank you so much. Have a great evening ahead.
Thank you very much.